Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode number 35 of History for Shut-ins. We're going to pick up today where we left off at the end of our last session, which ended abruptly, finishing talking about the relationship between Grant, Sherman, and Lincoln, which was extremely important, as well as the start of the Overland Campaign, which is where Grant and Lee first meet at the battles of the Wilderness, North Anna, and so forth. So that's where we'll go today. So Sherman understood that Grant was the dominant player in that relationship. Grant understood that Lincoln was the dominant player in their relationship, although Lincoln deferred to Grant militarily. Grant's greatness can be seen in his steady confidence, his will and tenacity that together with a willingness to shoulder the ultimate responsibility which previous Union commanders had not done, especially after losses. This provided a calming framework within which Sherman could thrive. Grant grasped Sherman's strong points from the outset. They fought together from the spring of 1862 until the end, directing storied campaigns in both the Western and Eastern theaters and presiding over the surrenders of the two principal Confederate armies in April 1865. Grant getting Lee's army to surrender and Sherman getting Joe Johnston's army to surrender. Grant learned to allow Sherman wide latitude and praised him often. When Sherman's critics suggested that the march to the sea had originated with others, Grant settled the matter in his voluminous personal memoirs, which were completed shortly before his death. Grant says, quote, "The question of who devised the plan of march from Atlanta to Savannah is easily answered. It was clearly Sherman, and to him also belongs the credit for its brilliant execution." Unquote. Sherman, for his part, recognizes Grant's rare ability to draw the best from his lieutenants. Sherman says, quote, "Grant possesses in an eminent degree that peculiar and high attribute of using various men to produce a common result, and now that his character is well established, we can easily subordinate ourselves to him with the absolute assurance of serving the common cause of our country." Unquote. Both men wrote memorable accounts of the war. The personal memoirs of Grant reveal the strategic vision, willingness to experiment, and daring that brought success at Vicksburg, at Chattanooga, and against Lee in Virginia, which we will begin to cover today. Grant's tribute to Zachary Taylor in the Mexican-American War illuminates Grant's own success. Taylor was a model that Grant followed. Grant, remember, fought in the Mexican-American War, as did Lee, as did many of the key players in the Civil War. Grant says, quote, "General Taylor was not an officer to trouble the administration with demands. No soldier could face either danger or responsibility more calmly than he. These are qualities more rarely found than genius or physical courage." Unquote. Remember, Grant is known for his coolness in battle, something that he copies from Taylor. Grant and Sherman agreed that victory required laying a hard hand on Confederate civilians as well as defeating Confederate armies. Grant's orders to Sherman following the fall of Atlanta allowed the Union Army to live off the land. Grant says to Sherman, quote, "You will, no doubt, clean the country where you go of railroad tracks and supplies. I would also move every wagon, horse, mule, and hoof of stock." Unquote. Sherman intended to persuade Confederate civilians that their government was helpless to defend them, and accusations of brutality would not stop him or slow him down. Grant, as I said in the previous episode, is truly one of the first modern generals who understands the key role that civilians play in the war. If you lose the backing and support of civilians, the Army's job becomes that much tougher. During the march to the sea, there are actually very few civilian casualties. Sherman is focused on basically gutting the Confederacy without harming civilians physically, but burning their homes, towns, livestock, on and on and on. As 1864 began, the war showed no indications of ending. Facing re-election, Lincoln knew he must make progress toward victory or risk his potential successor negotiating an end to the war that included recognizing the Confederacy as a separate nation. To win, Lincoln needed a general with initiative, habit of victory, and perseverance. Unable to find a worthy candidate in the Eastern armies, Lincoln turned to Grant, who at the time, remember, is the lead of all Western armies. Successful in the West, Grant demonstrated that he could win battles consistently without being influenced by the political intrigues that plagued the commanders of the Army of the Potomac. Think of McClellan, think of Hooker, think of McDowell, think of them all. Grant immediately made plans to press the Confederacy everywhere at once. Meade's Army of the Potomac would march against Lee in Virginia, while Sherman was in Georgia. Nathaniel Banks would be in Louisiana. Benjamin Butler would be on the James River in Virginia, and Franz Sigel would be in the Shenandoah Valley. They would all advance on Confederate armies in their respective fronts. Grant recognized that the Confederates could not win a war of attrition. He got the arithmetic. The Union completely outnumbers the Confederacy in number of men, also in war material and supplies. Grant instilled in his commanders the need to exhaust Confederate resources by destroying their armies and their means to fight. Grant made his headquarters in the saddle and attached himself to Meade's Army of the Potomac. For the first time in the war, destruction of the Confederate Army defending Richmond was the object of Meade's army, not the city of Richmond itself. Lee judged Grant's intentions and moved his army to confront him in the Wilderness, which we will talk about shortly. The Battle of the Wilderness opened 6 weeks of nearly constant marching and fighting. The armies clashed at the Wilderness, at Spotsylvania Court House, North Anna, Totopotomy Creek, Cold Harbor, and Trevelyan Station. By the campaign's end, and this is known as the Overland Campaign, both armies were in stalemate around Cold Harbor, where Grant planned to cross the James River and capture Petersburg. It was a signal to both armies that Grant would not quit until there was no more fighting left to do. Overall, in the campaign, there are 88,000 combined casualties. For that 6-week period, beginning May 4th and running until June 15th, 1864, the average was nearly 2,100 casualties per day in the constant fighting. Grant succeeded in wearing down Lee's army. The Confederates had 33,000 casualties compared to the Union's 55,000. However, for the Confederacy, this represented half of Lee's total strength. Remember, when Grant starts, he's got in Union forces now in all those areas I discussed, he's got more than 500,000 men. So they've got more men, not even close, but more men than the Confederacy. Although each army received reinforcements during and after the campaign, Grant's capacity to augment his army with reinforcements was vastly superior to Lee's. Lee was the tactical victor, forcing Grant and his superior numbers to maneuver away after nearly every battle of the campaign. Grant was not concerned with that because strategically, Grant is the winner. All those simultaneous advances of Banks, Sigel, and Butler failed. Grant succeeded at eliminating Lee's ability to mount an offensive. Forced inside the trenches at Richmond and Petersburg, the Confederacy's days were numbered, and Union victory was only a matter of time. Now, granted, it's almost another year, but the tables are now turned. In the wilderness, early May of 1864, the Army of the Potomac and the independent Ninth Corps, now both under Grant, about 120,000 men. So they outnumbered Lee by 2-1, just the Army of the Potomac and the independent Ninth Corps. They left winter camp in Culpeper County and marched south toward the Rapidan River fords. At dawn on May 4th, Union cavalry splashed across Germanna Ford, dispersing Confederate cavalry pickets, enabling Union engineers to construct 2 pontoon bridges. General Governor K. Warren's Fifth Corps crossed the ford and entered the dense, forbidding wilderness. Grant intended to push the army through the rough terrain of the wilderness into open ground as soon as possible because he knew he had superior numbers. Yet he would not shy away from attacking Lee if the opportunity presented himself. On the morning of May 5th, Warren resumes his march. He receives word that Confederate infantry was approaching from the west on the Orange Turnpike. His commander, Meade, ordered Warren to strike. Warren was apprehensive about making an attack in the wilderness, where dense thickets would make it difficult to maintain a battle line and would nullify the Federals' numerical superiority. Warren's corps advanced astride the Orange Turnpike. While Warren and Meade debated the merits of an attack along the Orange Turnpike, General Richard S. Ewell's Confederate Corps, these were Stonewall Jackson's old troops, halted on the turnpike 3 miles west of Wilderness Tavern and built strong earthworks on the west edge of Saunders Field. When Warren's men stepped out of the woods into the open, Ewell's troops exacted a fearful toll in casualties. The Union achieved a momentary breakthrough, but swift action by Brigadier General John B. Gordon's brigade sealed the breach. The arrival of the Union's 6th Corps did little more than broaden the front and increase the number of casualties. Shortly after Warren ran into the Confederates on the Orange Turnpike, Union Brigadier General Samuel Crawford at the William Chuning Farm observed another Confederate column headed east on the Orange Plank Road toward its intersection with Brock Road. This was a serious threat. If the Confederates gained possession of that area, they could drive a wedge between Warren's corps on the turnpike and Major General Winfield Hancock's Second Corps, which had passed Warren and moved further south. Meade quickly dispatched Brigadier General George Getty's 6th Corps Division to seize the crossroads. At 4 in the afternoon, Getty attacked, his men tearing through the dense thickets in vicious close-range fighting with General A.P. Hill's corps. Hancock arrived and rushed to support Getty, continuing the fight until nightfall ended the fighting. Hancock resumed the offensive on the morning of May 6th. A.P. Hill's tired troops were forced back, and the Confederates seemed on the verge of collapse. Brigadier General John Gregg's Texas Brigade from Longstreet's Corps arrived to stave off Confederate disaster. A pair of flank attacks by Longstreet south of the Plank Road and Gordon north of the Turnpike helped break the stalemate and force the Union behind breastworks. Just as Longstreet's men were on the brink of success, Longstreet was hit by an accidental volley by his own troops. With Longstreet wounded, Lee coordinated the final attacks on the Union line along the Brock Road. Hampered by heavy brush, remember they're in the wilderness, the Confederates stumbled forward without cohesion until they reached obstructions in front of the Union line. There they were stopped by volleys by Hancock's veterans. In one spot, the Confederates dashed forward and planted their flags on the burning works, but their success was short-lived. Within minutes, the Union counterattacked and reclaimed the works. On May 7th, both sides dug in and awaited attack. Realizing that he could no longer make headway in the wilderness, Grant ordered Meade's army to pull out after dark and head southeast towards Spotsylvania Court House. In the Battle of the Wilderness, 163,000 men were engaged in tight, close fighting. The Union suffered 17,000 casualties. Lee suffered 13,000. The Union, for the first time, remember, this is the first time Grant is leading an Eastern army. Actually, he's got control of all Union armies. But when he arrived east, Grant kept hearing about Bobby Lee, Bobby Lee, Bobby Lee. And Grant said, I've heard enough. Bobby Lee's got to be afraid of us. Well, what happens here is, although this is technically a Union loss, rather than retreat, the men are moving forward. That's a decided change under Grant compared to earlier commanders. They move on to Spotsylvania Court House. This battle takes place May 8th through May 21st. On the 7th, as we said, Grant issued orders for the army to march towards Spotsylvania Court House, a small village where the Brock Road met the road to Fredericksburg. Grant hoped to get between Lee's army and Richmond, or at the very least, to draw the Confederates into the open where he could take advantage of the Union's superior numbers. It was General Jeb Stuart's job to prevent the Union from reaching Spotsylvania. For 2 days, a division of Stuart's Confederate cavalry, led by Fitzhugh Lee, battled Union horsemen for control of the Brock Road. Forced to relinquish his position near Todd's Tavern, Lee withdrew to a rise of ground known as Laurel Hill on the south side of Brock Road on the 8th of May. Laurel Hill was the last defensible position north of Spotsylvania. If the Confederates lost the hill, they would lose the crossroads at the courthouse. Fortunately for the Confederates, help was near at hand. Major General Richard Anderson, now in command of Longstreet's First Corps, because remember, Longstreet was wounded in the wilderness, had marched for Spotsylvania during the night. And by the morning of May 8th, his troops were within 2 miles of Laurel Hill. Anderson's corps had just gone into bivouac near the Po River when one of Stuart's couriers arrived, warning him of the Union Army's approach. The new corps commander instantly put his troops back on the road and led them toward Laurel Hill. Believing Spotsylvania to be within his grasp, Union Major General Warren advanced his 5th Corps up to the hill, where they were surprised to find Anderson's corps opposing them. Warren's attempts to drive the Confederates off the hill were rebuffed by heavy losses, and both sides then began to entrench. During this fight, Major General John Sedgwick, commander of the Union 6th Corps, was shot dead, becoming the highest ranking Union officer killed in action during the war. Grant tried to break the deadlock at Spotsylvania. On May 9th, he sent a portion of Hancock's Second Corps across the Po River to find Lee's left flank. Spying Hancock's move, Lee shifted 2 divisions to counter the Union at Blockhouse Bridge, forcing the Federals back across the river. Grant spent May 10th probing Lee's line for weaknesses and nearly found one when Colonel Emory Upton briefly breached the Confederate line with a tightly packed, fast-moving column of 12 regiments. Though Upton's assault was indecisive, it gave Grant an idea. By May 12th, the Confederates established a long line of earthworks, which included a huge half-mile bulge or salient called the Mule Shoe, the Mule Shoe, because of its shape. Grant massed 20,000 men of the Second Corps opposite the tip of the salient. Lee noted the Federal movement, but mistakenly believing that Grant was preparing to withdraw. Remember, Lee hasn't faced Grant but once, so he doesn't know that that's really not in Grant's DNA. But Lee, thinking that Grant is going to withdraw, removed his artillery from the area. Thus, when Hancock's men advanced on the morning of May 12th, they struck the Confederate line where only infantry remained. After an initial breakthrough, Lee shifted reinforcements into the salient just as Grant threw more troops at the Confederate works. Fighting devolved into horrific hand-to-hand, point-blank fighting amid a torrential downpour, which lasted for 22 hours and claimed 17,000 casualties. The numbers are staggering. The area would forever be known as the Bloody Angle. The stubborn stand by the Confederates at the Bloody Angle gave Lee time to construct a new line of earthworks across the base of the salient. The exhausted Federals did not test the new line right away. Instead, Grant slid his army to the left, followed by Lee sliding to his right. For 3 days, both sides consolidated their new lines. When Grant attacked Lee's new position early on May 18th, they were met by massed artillery fire and easily pushed back. Grant called off the attack. Believing it best to continue moving his army south and east, on May 19th, Grant ordered Hancock to pull back the Second Corps toward the Fredericksburg Road. Observing the movement, Lee sent Ewell's Second Corps forward as reconnaissance to determine where the heck the Union was going. Ewell's men ran into stiff resistance by a brigade of new heavy artillery turned infantry regiments at the Harris family farm. The new heavies, as they were called, overmanned Ewell's understrength brigades and turned back the Confederate probe. On the evening of May 20th, both sides pulled out of their Spotsylvania Court House defenses and moved south and east towards the North Anna River. Casualties from both sides over 12 days of fighting were more than 30,000, with Grant losing 17,000 men and Lee losing 13,000. The Overland Campaign continues at North Anna. This takes place May 23rd through 26th As you can see, fighting is just day after day after day after day with a break here and a break there, not much. Facing stalemate at Spotsylvania Court House, Grant knew he had to force Lee from the Confederate trenches. Despite heavy losses, Grant would not withdraw, hoping one more battle would prove a decisive Union victory. To bring the Confederacy to battle, or the Confederate forces, to battle, Grant offered Lee a potential prize, the Union Second Corps of Hancock. Grant ordered Meade to send the corps toward Hanover Junction, a vital rail junction just south of the North Anna River, using the Mattapony River as a shield. Lee would have to react to such a threat to his supply line and to Richmond. Once Lee came out of his earthworks, Grant would unleash hell. Lee was puzzled by Grant's movements early on May 21st, but had no intention of attacking the Second Corps, so he wasn't taking the bait. No matter Grant's intent, Lee knew he had to cover the inside route to Richmond and protect his supply line. Lee determined to fall back to a favorable defense line along the North Anna River, where the river would funnel Grant's troops to limited crossings, which were easily defensible. So Grant's superior numbers would work against him here. A brush with Confederate infantry at Milford Station that same day convinced the Second Corps commander, Hancock, that he should not move any further south without additional support. Grant began to draw the disparate corps of the Army of the Potomac together to move south toward the North Anna. After extricating themselves from a tremendous traffic jam, the lead elements of the Union Army, Warren's 5th Corps followed by Hancock's 2nd Corps, approached the North Anna River on May 23rd. Hancock moved toward Chesterfield Bridge over the river and a small redoubt manned by Colonel John W. Hennigan's South Carolina Brigade. Despite sending messengers to the rear as they watched Union skirmishers advance, Hennigan received no Confederate reinforcements, nor any orders of retreat. Shortly after 6 in the evening, an artillery barrage prefaced an infantry attack by Hancock's men, who scrambled up the Confederate defenses and chased the Confederates back across the river. That same day, the 23rd, Warren's corps crossed the river unopposed at Jericho Mill. That evening, Lieutenant General A.P. Hill struck Warren, nearly throwing the Union back across the North Anna River. Though surprised, the Union rallied and the Confederates fell back. Lee's North Anna line was now breached. On May 24th, using terrain and Grant's aggressiveness against him, Lee hoped to draw the Union into a trap. A strong salient, the inverted V, anchored on the dominant bluffs of Ox Ford, became the centerpiece of Lee's defensive position, which was almost like a Gibraltar. It was impregnable. Should Grant advance, he would break his army into 3 parts, one on Telegraph Road, one at Ox Ford, and the third at Jericho Mills. Each flank would have to cross the river twice to reinforce the other. Grant would surely attack, giving Lee the chance to pin a large mass of the enemy army against the river. Troubled by the lack of movement in his center, Grant ordered his only available unit, Ambrose Burnside's 9th Corps, to move toward Ox Ford on May 24th. Finding Confederate defenses there too strong, Burnside sent Brigadier General Thomas L. Crittenden's division to cross above Oxford and come in from behind, and another division over the Chesterfield Bridge to clear the ford from the opposite direction. With two divisions converging on Oxford, Burnside hoped that the Confederates would withdraw. Once across, Crittenden discovered exceptionally strong enemy trenches, more than one division could handle alone. Unfortunately, a rash order from a drunk officer, Brigadier General James H. Ledlie, sent a Union brigade to within 100 yards of the Confederate works, where they were quickly swept from the field. The Union. On the 24th, Hancock pushed his entire corps across the Chesterfield Bridge. That afternoon, the Union ran into Confederate skirmishers, sparking a furious firefight and a hand-to-hand struggle near the Doswell House at Hanover Junction. Darkness ended the fighting, and Grant ordered his commanders to halt and dig in. On the 25th of May, Grant evaluated Lee's position and admitted, quote, to make a direct attack from either wing would cause a slaughter of our men that even success would not justify, unquote. One of the few times Grant got ahead of his aggressiveness. His army was split in three: the 5th and 6th Corps at Jericho Mill, a lone division of Burnside's command on the north side of Oxford, and Hancock's 2nd Corps at the Junction. On the evening of May 26th, the Union withdrew in another turning movement to Totopotomy Creek. Lee follows. Totopotomy Creek. The battle takes place May 28th through May 30th. After falling back from the North Anna River, Lee sought a new line of defense between Richmond and Grant's pursuing Union forces. Since the battle in the Wilderness 3 weeks earlier, Grant had kept constant pressure on Lee, not allowing him to withdraw from his front. The near constant fighting wore down Lee's army as casualties mounted. Fighting erupted again on May 27th with cavalry skirmishes at the Pamunkey River crossing at Dabney's Ferry and along Crump's Creek and Hawes Shop on May 28th. On May 29th, Confederates constructed a line of breastworks on a ridge overlooking the east-west running Totopotomy Creek, forcing the Union to halt and look for a path around the fortifications. Major General Horatio Wright's 6th Corps pressed Lee's skirmishers from the north, while Warren's 5th Corps moved toward Lee's right. In the center, Hancock's 2nd Corps took a position near the Edwin Shelton Estate at Rural Plains on Totopotomy Creek, opposite the waiting Confederates. Grant ordered an attack along his line for May 30th. On the right, Wright's corps got bogged down in the swamps of Crump's Creek and never got into a favorable position to attack. In the center, the 2nd Corps Division of Brigadier General Francis Barlow forced a crossing at Rural Plains and captured the first line of Confederate trenches, but his advance was stopped at the main line. The Union 9th Corps under Burnside, supporting Hancock, moved into position late and pushed back Confederate skirmishers along the Shady Grove Road near Pole Green Church, but didn't mount a serious attack across the creek. On the Union left, Warren attempted a turning movement near Bethesda Church, but was repulsed by Confederates under Jubal Early that otherwise might have been occupied in Burnside's front. Skirmishing continued for another day with little result. After 2 days of fighting, there were 2,300 casualties, which seems like a drop in the bucket compared to earlier battles. However, two-thirds of them were Confederate. The impending arrival of Union reinforcements from Bermuda Hundred compelled Lee to abandon his Totopotomy Creek line of defense. He ordered a movement further south toward Cold Harbor. As before, Lee was followed closely by Grant. That is where we will end today. We'll pick up tomorrow as the Overland Campaign moves forward with the battle at Cold Harbor. Thank you so much for joining today. If there are any questions, please leave them here and I'll happily answer them. Feel free to share History for Shut-ins information with friends and family, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow, 5 p.m. Thanks so much. Have a good night.